Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, standing in for Aaron Bastani. And I'm joined tonight by Freddie Feltham from the What the F is Left podcast. Freddie, it's your first time on the show. I want to get you to sort of tell the audience a bit about yourself. I discovered you from an interview you did with Aaron Bastani a couple of weeks ago, which was very, very interesting. Tell us, what is your podcast? How did you start it? What's the idea? What's your project?
Sure. Thanks so much, Michael and Novara, for having me on. F in the chat for being a Labour guy. I know we're kind of washed right now, especially with the Novara audience. But look, man, I set up a podcast because I used to work for the Labour Party, and I was concerned about, I guess, what the political project is. And I know this is probably something that resonates with a lot of people on the left right now. But I feel like we're in a sliding doors moment between a past understanding of how politics works and is prosecuted, and a future that looks fundamentally different in our communication reality, in the way in which we organize ourselves, in the way in which we understand really what is going on. And so that's the point of the podcast. We ask ourselves and our guests and the audience, what is left? What is left of British politics? What is left of our institutions? What is the political left in a world which seems completely unrecognizable to the kind of political theory that Marx would have been imagining many centuries ago?
Buy the Marx t-shirts, though. He's still relevant as a fashion icon, if nothing else. I shouldn't say if nothing else. Obviously, he's got a lot to say. Coming up tonight, Shabana Mahmood. It's a bit of an understatement. Shabana Mahmood faces huge backlash over her asylum overhaul. We'll talk about the backlash. Got an interview on that. Zack Polanski is making political hay out of this. I mean, I don't know. Again, that's somewhat dismissive, isn't it? Zack Polanski is hitting back against this, and sort of lots of people are very much infused by that. The Renters' Rights Act is set to become law. Will that mean that landlords might try and kick out their tenants before it comes into effect? I'll speak to an expert on the topic. And we close the show with actually a really, really interesting interview with journalist Sami Hamdi about his detention by ICE. So he's a very, very prominent journalist, was recently in ICE detention for 18 days. He's just got back to the UK. You won't want to miss that. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support, and make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube chat. On yesterday's show, we discussed Labour's newly announced Danish-style asylum plans. And we're going to focus today on the backlash, which has been pretty big. In a debate in Parliament yesterday night, Mahmood was attacked from her own back benches, and one particular policy kept coming up.
I hope that we could all agree that a strong immigration system doesn't have to be a cruel one. Yeah. When the Tories painted over murals for refugee children, the numbers of small boat crossings still went up. When they threatened deportations to Rwanda, guess what? The crossings still went up. Yeah. So what evidence does the Secretary of State have that taking personal belongings, such as jewellery from refugees, and selling it off actually works as a deterrent? Isn't a focus on the new plans outlined on the safe and legal routes a much better use of all of our time?
Yeah. I say to my honourable friend, we are not taking jewellery at the border. I can't say it any more clearly than that.
So that's interesting, actually, because that was a big set of headlines that rightly infuriated many people. Now, it's unclear what's happened here. Was it the case that the Home Office briefed people that they were going to take jewellery, and then the backlash was so big that they've U-turned on that? Or was, had journalists got carried away with themselves? Was it, purposefully placed in the media so that then they could sort of say, we're actually not as extreme as that? Confusing. Anyway, I mean, obviously it's good that they're no longer going to be taking jewellery from people seeking asylum, which was always, I think, just a gruesome policy, as we said yesterday. As you saw, Mahmood was fairly restrained in that answer. In other answers, she was more forthright, more dismissive. This was an exchange with the Greens' Carla Denyer.
Does the Secretary of State understand that attempting to out-reform reform is actually just boosting this baseless far-right narrative and will only deepen divisions when we urgently need leadership and hope instead?
Let me tell her, I couldn't care less what any other political party has to say about these matters. I don't care what other politicians are saying on the television. I don't care what other activists are saying either. I care about the fact that I have an important job to do, and I can see that there is a problem here that needs to be fixed. If it was possible to pretend there wasn't a problem because there wasn't one, I wouldn't be saying there is one. There is a genuine problem in this asylum system, and we need someone to sort it out, not to pretend it doesn't exist, which I'm afraid is one of the things that fuels the division in the first place. My own constituents, since I have been Home Secretary, have been telling me directly of abuses in the visa system that they can see with the evidence of their own eyes long before any officials in Whitehall have ever clocked onto those things. It is a moral responsibility when you see something broken to fix it and to make sure that the fact that it's broken is not fueling division in our country. And let me also say to her, it is Green Party politicians who are absolute hypocrites because they talk great language in here and then oppose asylum accommodation in their own constituencies.
So that last jibe was about the Greens' deputy leader opposing 600 asylum seekers being housed in her area. But I assume Carla Denny looked so desperate to come back and so furious because the basis of Rachel Millward's complaint, so Rachel Millward, the new deputy leader or one of the new deputy leaders of the Greens, her complaint was in part that she didn't think immigrants should be housed on a military site anyway, and especially if they have no right to work, and she supports them having a right to work and to be, I suppose, housed in communities. So she would say not immigration, not opposition to immigration per se, and not just a case of NIMBYism because she opposes on principle. In an answer to the Lib Dems Home Affairs spokesperson, Mahmood got even more personal though.
I have to say to the honourable gentleman, I wish I had the privilege of walking around this country and not seeing the division that the issue of migration and asylum system is creating across this country. Unlike him, unfortunately, I am the one that is regularly called a fucking packy and told to go back home. It is I who knows through my personal experience and that of my constituents just how divisive the issue of asylum has become in our country.
Someone who was more impressed with the policy was Nigel Farage, so he tweeted this. Whilst the strong language from Shabana Mahmood is encouraging even an audition to join reform, I have serious doubts. Will it survive her own backbenchers? In a vote, will the new legal routes lead to even higher numbers? Will the ECHR, with the ECHR in place, can any of this work? Now, the supportive part of that tweet at the beginning was probably the one that most people noticed, but Mahmood brushed that off in an interview.
He said
he
said you'd be welcome to join reform with these sorts of asylum.
Honestly, Nigel Farage can sod off. I'm not interested in anything he's got to say.
No, but really,
someone who Mahmood might take more seriously is Labour peer Lord Alf Dubs, who came to Britain in 1939 as a refugee fleeing the Nazis.
My particular fear is integration in local communities. If people are here temporarily, and people know they're here temporarily, then the danger is that local people say, well, you're only here for a bit. Why should we help you to integrate? Why should your kids go to local schools and so on? Because people who are going to be removed are hardly going to be welcome as if they're people who want to integrate into our local communities.
None of this backlash will be much of a surprise to the Labour Party. They will presumably price most of this in. Of course, it will only be worth the political cost if it actually works to do what they want it to do, which is to reduce small boat crossings. And on that front, not everyone is convinced. Actually, not many people are convinced. One of them is Beth Gardiner-Smith. She's Senior Policy Associate at the Future Governance Forum. She was also the founding CEO of the charity Safe Passage. Interestingly, was a former advisor to Yvette Cooper.
I really think the jury's out. Well, in fact, I'd go further than that. I would say that the evidence doesn't really stack up when it comes to this type of policy making. I think what many of us find quite frustrating is this real focus on deterrence and the idea that you can deter asylum seekers from taking irregular journeys or arriving in your country by making different changes to your domestic asylum policy. The evidence just does not support that approach at all. And look, it's pretty obvious why, right? Because most people, unlike us policy nerds, most people in Britain don't really know what our asylum policy really says when it comes to the detail, let alone an asylum seeker who's made a journey, sometimes many years across different countries, and doesn't always have a destination in mind when they do that. So what I'm afraid to say is I think the evidence is really poor on this kind of policy making and whether it will actually impact numbers arriving.
I've heard that idea has been put to Labour politicians over the past couple of days. and what they often respond and say, I can't remember if it was Shabana Mahmood or one of the ministers sort of saying, they've seen the videos of people smugglers sort of sending someone a video that says, if you go to England, you can get, put up in a hotel, and soon you will be able to work on the black market, et cetera, et cetera. So their claim is that they have, I suppose they haven't produced the evidence, but they say the evidence is there. I mean, how would you respond to that?
Well, look, I mean, we can all come up with our own anecdotal evidence. I used to run an organisation that worked on the ground in Calais. So we've all got our own stories about what refugees say. But the reality is, if you actually look at the research behind this, the studies that have provided credible evidence over the years about this type of policymaking, is that migrants and refugees do not have a very good idea about what a domestic policy landscape at all. They may well have a perception about what life will be like in that country, but that's just as likely to be informed by misinformation than it is by credible information about the benefits that they might obtain or not in that country. What the evidence says is the far more important factors when it comes to where asylum seekers are likely to seek protection are things like family, things like whether people speak the language, presence of diaspora communities. And we know in the UK that, these are all reasons why people would choose the UK over other countries in Europe.
You were an advisor to Yvette Cooper a while ago, before 2015, before starting a refugee charity, or I suppose a policy group sort of talking about refugee and asylum policy. She's obviously not Home Secretary anymore, but when she was very much speaking the language of deterrence that you seem to disagree with. What's your analysis of where, I think also you're a Labour councillor, aren't you? What's your analysis of where the Labour Party have found itself on this issue?
I mean, I think that the Labour Party found itself in a very difficult position and doesn't seem to be reaching for the right answers at the moment. There is actually good solutions that are on the table. In fact, I think the UK-France deal is a very good solution that is backed by the evidence, but it's only going to work if they can scale it. And so what I'd say is that they should be putting a lot of energy and resource into trying to scale that with other partner countries, rather than pursuing these sorts of policies of deterrence that are only going to harm integration in the long run, and at worst not going to have any impact on numbers coming across the channel, which only further erodes people's confidence in government to be able to run a controlled and well-managed system.
I just want to briefly clarify sort of the way that the word deterrence is being used, because the one in, one out policy, that agreement with France that you seem to support, there's an element of deterrence to that, right? Because it's to say, if you cross the channel, you might well get deported back to France, and therefore the journey was pointless. Or if you want it to be expanded to Germany or Austria or wherever, there is an element of deterrence there. It's just not the kind of deterrence that Shabana Mahmood is talking about, which is to say, if you do make it to the UK, you might be able to stay, but your life is going to be miserable.
Yeah, that's right. And so if we want to get into the detail of what the research says on this, there are some deterrents that do make a difference. So, for instance, if you really restrict people's access to asylum, which in most situations is not legitimate to do, and would be not consistent with our international obligations, you can have a sort of impact on people's decision making. Similarly, if you increase the cost so high that you're, increasing the risk of death or serious harm, that also has an impact on people's decision making. So, of course, some deterrents do work. I would argue that the UK-France deal has a humane deterrent and a deterrent within it that is consistent with our international obligations, because it involves returning people back to France, which is deemed a safe country, and it also is consistent with our obligations in that it means us taking people who are seeking asylum here in the UK in equal number as well. So yes, technically there are some deterrents that work, but most of them are unpalatable. And the ones that have been announced this week are not the sort of deterrents that will have any impact.
You wrote an article for Labour List this morning talking about sort of what you think Labour should be proposing. So expanding the one in, one out policy is one of them. You also mentioned to sort of shorten the backlog, giving Sudanese and Syrian people immediate limited leave to remain so that they can work and get out of hotels, because there's an extremely high chance that they'll be given asylum anyway. And you also suggested introducing something a bit like the Homes for Ukraine policy, whereby people could put themselves forward to house asylum seekers so that they wouldn't have to be put up in hotels, which would presumably save the state some money and help with integration, and presumably would be nicer for the refugees as well. Talk to me about those alternatives which you're proposing, and why you think that's not the route Labour is taking at the moment.
Well, we don't know on asylum hotels yet, do we? Because we're yet to see a full plan from the Home Office. But look, the other area that is clearly a source of massive tension in parts of the country, not the whole country, is asylum hotels. They're not good for community cohesion. They're also not good for asylum seekers themselves to be in those conditions. And so, we think that one of the top priorities for the Home Secretary needs to be to get out of hotels far quicker than 2029. And there are different approaches that can be taken here. What we're suggesting is that you need to basically deal with the backlog really quickly. And there's an appeals backlog, and there's also just a backlog of cases to get through. And what you do is you take, the top 5 nationalities that are most likely to be, have really high grant rates, or are countries where we are not currently returning people back to. So, ultimately, these people are going to need to, get some sort of leave and integrate into communities. And what you do is you give them a temporary limited leave whilst you're deciding their asylum claim. So their asylum claim still runs in the background. But what that means is that they're out of hotels, they have the right to work, and can move forward. At the same time, you could see the government open a Homes for Ukraine's type scheme that allowed volunteers to step forward and say, look, we would be happy to host somebody who's going through that process in our homes, just like members of the public did for Ukraine. What you see with sponsorship programs like that is that it actually really strengthens, support for doing our bit to support refugees over the long run. And it's also another way that you can just remove some of the people out of, those unsuitable hotel conditions. So those are measures that we could see that you could get people out of hotels really quickly. Some of this is drawn from work that the Refugee Council has done, which estimates over 30,000 people could be removed from hotels within a matter of months. And then what you need to decide is, okay, so what do you do with those savings? So we're also suggesting that what the government should be looking at is both a fund to invest some of those savings in temporary housing stock, so a capital fund that would mean that local authorities could actually buy and add to their existing stock for temporary accommodation that would help asylum seekers, but also other vulnerable families and homeless families in the community, and a potential one-off investment fund for communities that have hosted hotels as well, to be able to really invest in integration in those parts of the country. And we think that is the sort of package that can both deal with the open wound that is hotels in communities at the moment, but also leave a long-term legacy in some of those areas.
Let's go to another angle on this story. Labour's new hardline policy has opened them up to a significant backlash from the left, and Zack Polanski is leading that charge.
Zack Polanski, how would you describe these plans?
Well, we've just heard that rebellions are under the radar. That's not good enough. Every single Labour MP needs to look to their conscience.
Why?
The interview we just heard, you said it yourself. The question was, you never told anyone when they voted they were voting for this. This is extreme, this is inhumane, and it is a government of cowards. Rather than take on the powerful, because the issue here is not immigration, it's inequality. They went for pensioners, they went for the disabled, and now they're going for people who are fleeing war and conflict. I am furious. So many people are furious because this is a totally unconscionable way to deal with things. And how dare the minister say we are an open, tolerant country? How dare she come tonight to Newsnight and talk about compassion at the same time they're talking about seizing people's assets? I am a child of Jewish ancestry. I am Jewish. We have seen this with Nazi Germany. We are seeing it in 2025. This government needs to hang their heads in shame.
Freddie, are Shabana Mahmood's proposals a gift to the Greens?
God, I think that jewellery, mistake or leaving that clause in the Home Office briefings, which Shabana rode back on, probably is a gift to the Greens, because Zack Polanski gains a lot from framing Labour as fascist, as reform light. We know that that's his political strategy. So it's obvious that would be the kind of way that he would attack Labour, and I guess that's obviously the line that he chose there. I mean, look, the thing that Zack Polanski profits from, which he's been very effective at doing, is managing people's emotion and anger right now at the political crisis that we're living in, which is essentially an economic crisis, right? It's one that's happening all over across the world. We've had stagnation for 17 years. People feel as if their living standards, if not are stagnating, declining. And he's got a very strong attack line there, right? He's able to say that, hey, look, Labour are being reform here, and that puts him in a stronger position.
What do you think of this particular policy? I mean, I suppose you are still a Labour member. Often when we talk about Zack Polanski, we have sort of Helena talking about it, who's a Green Party member. I think most of the sort of core Novara people have left Labour for whatever reasons. I suppose, as a Labour member, what do you think of what Shabana Mahmood announced yesterday?
I actually agree with most of what the Home Secretary is trying to do here. I'm not a big fan of this kind of jewellery idea. I guess what they were thinking was, in the Danish model, they have a clause that if an asylum seeker has some assets that they own, I'm not talking about jewellery or sentimental items here, maybe it's a laptop or an e-scooter or whatever, then they should give that up to pay for the costs of their being housed. Now, apparently that's actually not enforced, that is used as a deterrent. And as your previous interview just pointed out, incentives do kind of matter here in how we manage how people, asylum seekers' attitudes to what's happening to immigration. I guess my concern is, like everyone else, the only people who've really, ended asylum seeking and closed the border is US taking a super hard line, I would say almost proto-fascist response with ICE, right? I don't want to see that in this country. I'm absolutely terrified by the notion that could happen in this country. You've got Piers Morgan going on Question Time saying stuff like, well, look, maybe we should deploy the army because we need to get a grip on these sorts of things. And maybe we should learn a bit from Trump on this sort of stuff. Of course, Reform are thinking, who has done this and how can we apply it here? And I'm just of the opinion that if the one thing that is driving support for the Reform Party fundamentally is about their prognosis on immigration, Reforms start from immigration, don't they? And they build their political coalition from that specific problem. And the way we've seen, politics unravel over the last year with the migrant hotel protests at Epping, last year Southport riots, this is clearly an unsustainable way to manage this specific issue. And immigration has as much salience as the economy right now as a political problem. And I think that the positioning of the left has been, instinctively we're pro-migration. The Obama coalition, right? Like Rainbow Coalition of People. I am a child of migration. I don't know if you are, Michael, but Aaron is a child of migration. Ash is a child of migration. Our natural instinct is to take a defensive posture on these issues. But I don't think that when you look at the data closely, and there's a great video, actually, Sky did a video going back to the Magna Carta about immigration percentage changes in population. So the percentage of immigration in created population change is unprecedented that we're living through right this moment. Now, the story of UK and like every place in the world, of course, is a story of migratory patterns. But that percentage is an important point, right? Because ultimately, there has to be some sort of level that a society can absorb a new population of people. It's been clear since 2010 that people have told us at every single election, essentially, that they want to lower immigration. Labour's positioning, Zack Polanski said there, we didn't vote for this. This wasn't in the manifesto. And to a degree, he's right, because Labour were really, and I remember thinking this at HQ in the time, we would say, we're going to smash the gangs. And in a way, we were like, this is a good line because everyone agrees that people dying in the Channel is wrong. But it didn't fundamentally explain what we were actually going to do. And we already knew that what was driving a wedge between the Tories and Reform was fundamentally an attitude to lowering immigration. And look, my position is I'm not a net zero immigration person, but neither is the Home Secretary. We're obviously going to need to be a country of immigration. But I think the only way we can be a country of immigration is through control. And if we've learned anything about the way in which the far right have been insurgent in not just British, but let's say politics all across the world, it's by exploiting this specific issue. So the idea fundamentally that we don't do anything, I just think is flawed.
Let's talk about a significant difference between Denmark and here. So in Denmark, they have proportional representation, which meant that the Social Democrats could go for, I suppose, the socially conservative. I mean, it's not reform curious there. It would be I think it's the Danish Popular Party, isn't it? But people who are sort of sympathetic to the right, sort of the Social Democrats could position themselves in the centre there. And then if there were people who were completely outraged by this, they could go vote for the Greens or the left. And that would be fine. It wouldn't split the vote because they have proportional representation and they can go into coalition after the election. Here, the Labour Party, if we're talking about this purely in terms of electoral calculations, do have a more difficult game to play, I suppose, because it's not enough to just win those reform-curious people in the middle. If they then lose all of the Liberal left to the Greens, they're going to be in a problem. And that does seem likely to happen, I suppose. I'm going to go to two pieces of polling about this. So YouGov yesterday asked, thinking about people who come to the UK to seek asylum from war or persecution, do you think, and then if they are found to be genuine refugees, they should generally be allowed to settle permanently in the UK? Now, only 29% of people think that, compared to 51% who think that even if you're a genuine refugee, your stay should only be temporary until your home country is safe. And there's actually a majority for that position, that it should only be temporary in all the parties, obviously much higher in the Conservatives and Reform. However, even if it is an overall popular policy, if it divides the left-wing vote, it could still help Reform. So a policy that's intended to stop Reform could help Reform. Let's look at YouGov's latest voting intention poll. So you've got Reform on 27, Labour on 19, Tories on 17, and the Greens on 17. The Greens are up 2 points since the last one. So we've already had sort of Find Out Now, which is a new pollster having the Greens ahead. It looks like in YouGov, which is sort of the gold standard pollster, I suppose, the Greens could be about to overtake Labour. Just talking electorally, do you think this could be a mistake, Freddie? Because they don't have the luxury of the Danish Social Democrats, which is a PR system. If you are, I suppose, sort of presenting yourselves as these incredibly tough on migration group of people, yeah, that might appeal to some people on the right, but you're going to shed more voters on your left, and then a divided left with a united right. The right does seem like it's going to unite behind Reform. That could be the worst of all worlds.
I think this is a significant problem for Labour. I know people are going to be upset with what I've been saying about immigration. I haven't read the comments yet, but I imagine you guys are cooking me. But, firstly, also, thank you for showing a YouGov poll. I thought we'd be getting a Find Out Now or a Merlin Strategies there. But yeah, look, this is obviously an issue. And I don't feel, as someone, of the left, that we should be abandoning Greens or, Lib Dems or whatever. I think that we need to figure out what is the project that is going to unite the left. Now, broadly speaking, you could have a cordon sanitaire and some coalition maybe of Greens and Labour and Lib Dems. I think it will never happen under Starmer for obvious reasons. Polanski made that really clear. I think Keir's made that really clear as well. But that's not going to be enough anyway, because that's not really a mandate to govern. I mean, the left needs to ask itself ultimately, do we believe that we should have control of our borders? I think everyone says yes to that question. Then what level of immigration do we think genuinely makes sense? Ultimately, institutions survive because they're built on foundations of trust and belonging. What is clear right now is that people don't feel like they have trust in our institutions, and they don't feel like they have trust in their communities. Of course, we can make a material or analysis about why that's the case, and maybe we want to say it's downstream of economics. But, there's something deeper is happening here that is dividing us. And I'm not saying this as somebody, I'm not like I really want to stress this, I'm not like a hard line anti-immigration, pull up the ladder sort of person. Bastani came onto our podcast and we spoke about this. And I said that it just feels now that we are in a moment of crisis where we have to some degree, grasp the nettle. And I know that the Home Secretary said this herself, I'm getting racist abuse because of the way in which the country feels at the moment divided. And I guess that I'm not a big fan of consequentialist reasoning for any sort of policy, but it seems abundantly clear to me that even Greens need to think about this. we need to think about an immigration policy that has a democratic mandate. For me, the immigration stuff is actually not really about kind of vote catching, or, even though obviously it appears that way, it appears that Labour are attacking right or whatever, but this feels like a watershed moment for the left generally. I mean, in the EU, right, they're thinking about returns agreements, they're thinking about Rwanda-style policies with countries in North Africa. I personally would like to see Labour go closer to the EU, but that would probably mean we would have some views about immigration that would be closer to them now. So there's a lot at play here that I think through the traditional lenses and heuristics of politics don't really add up on an electoral calculus of the way that we've kind of thought about it traditionally, which is that Labour will tap right to take up Tory switchers, and now because Tory switchers are going to reform, we're going to tap right again to get reform voters. Ultimately, we need to learn about what's been successful with Zack Polanski, which is something that we've known for absolutely ages, by the way, which is that a positive vision that people can unite behind is the way in which progressive politics work best. What is the future that we're imagining? And I don't think Labour really got to the core of that argument yet. And, there's stuff in the Blue Labour analysis, right? If you've read their recent, you go on their Twitter, you can read what they've said. I think analytically, they're correct. Analytically, what they're saying is that the end of, privatisation has been an absolute awful kind of destructive force to our politics, that these deindustrialised communities virtually were forgotten about under globalisation. They say that we need to do something along the lines of reindustrialization, as well as obviously bringing immigration down. I think we need to do something completely different. I don't think we can go backwards in time. I think we need to think about what is that thing that's going to bring us forward. Now, of course, I don't have the answers, guys. I'm 25, right? Just give me a bit of time. Let me cook. But I'm still thinking in my head that ultimately this traditional way in which strategists have been thinking about this politics, as you've rightly pointed out, Michael, is not going to work.
A big problem with Shabana Mahmood is that I'm not sure this policy is going to work for the reasons my guest was saying earlier. So I think you might lose the left without... The only thing that's going to win back reform voters is if you actually stop the vote. It's not talking tough on migration. That's not going to help. And I don't think this policy will. So I think there's a danger that it just pisses off a lot of people and doesn't achieve very much, but we'll see. The Renters' Rights Act became law at the end of last month, but it was only on Friday that the government announced a timetable to implement its various reforms. They're taking a bit of time. The Act will be implemented in 3 phases. First, the key reforms for tenants, which include the abolition of Section 21 notices, so arbitrary evictions. That will come into force from May. Open-ended tenancies will also be introduced there, meaning it will be generally up to tenants rather than landlords to decide how long they'll stay in a rental home. There are important exceptions, I should say. The landlord can get the house back if they want to sell it or if a family member wants to move in. But at the moment, the landlord can kick you out whenever you want, and, that's fine. All of this might be too much for some landlords. They don't like having their freedom to evict people constrained, or they might not like that. Well, the Telegraph ran this story last week. It claimed that the 6-month wait before the new law is enforced, so this new rental rights law, means that landlords will race to sell up, reducing supply and pushing rents higher. So if all these landlords say, I really don't want to have a tenant if I can't get rid of them without an excuse, if I can't use my Section 21, then let's sell the house before it comes into law. And so the idea is that this policy, which was supposed to help renters, could backfire. So should renters fear getting booted out between now and next May? I spoke earlier to Tom Darling, director of the Renters Reform Coalition.
Yes, potentially, but I suppose only insofar as they should fear being booted out of their homes at the moment. So the law is, as it has been broadly since the Thatcher deregulation of private renting in the 80s and 90s, whereby a landlord has a huge amount of power over tenants and can evict tenants without reason, known as Section 21 or no-fault evictions. Obviously, the Renters' Rights Act, the main provision of this is to abolish that and change the tenancy system so that it is all rolling tenancies, and that will come into force on the 1st of May 2026. We, as groups in the Renters Reform Coalition, have been campaigning for this change, some organisations for more than 10 years. So we're pleased to have a date, even though the delays to implementation are not what we would have hoped for. I think the main thing to bear in mind is you see a lot of scarce stories in like the right-wing press about landlords selling up. We've seen no evidence that the private rented sector has shrunk in size to date. And you see some stories about, the landlords might evict ahead of the reforms coming into force. I mean, these are basic regulations. And so if a landlord can't meet their new obligations, then arguably, I would argue they shouldn't be a landlord anyway.
But also, I mean, the housing market isn't particularly strong at the moment, and they would have to be able to sell the house or sell it to another landlord who would have sort of all just the same issues. So, I mean, maybe if it were the case that sort of house prices were very high at the moment, I mean, they're always high, but if they were sort of relatively high at the moment, then there would be more of a risk of landlords selling up, but they're not. So hopefully renters don't have to worry about getting kicked out before they get these new rights in May. Let's talk about some of the other features that's in the Renters Reform Bill, which, as you say, you've been sort of campaigning for and which is now, it's already come into law now. It is coming into force. So Section 21 goes in May. Then by the end of next year, landlords will have to register on a national database. Then after that, they'll be subject to national standards, apparently for the first time ever. They've never had any standards before. Talk about what will happen next other than the abolition of Section 21.
So the ban on Section 21 comes into force on the 1st of May. Most of the, parts of the Act that renters themselves will interface with come into force on the 1st of May. So that includes the fact that you can challenge rent increases, which is above market rates, to a tribunal. Rent increases can only be given by your landlord once a year. There'll be a ban on, when you're looking for a new tenancy, there's a ban on bidding wars, and estate agents and landlords trying to start bidding wars, and ban on discrimination against renters who are families with children and also in receipt of benefits. Landlords can't unreasonably refuse requests for pets and other changes to the tenancy system. So all of that comes into force on 1st of May. There are then a few more bodies being set up. The first is the private rented sector database, it's basically a national landlord register, which will hopefully be a useful tool for renters to be able to see who their landlord is. I mean, some of your listeners will be listening to this and they might not even actually know who their landlord is or where they live. And so that sort of transparency will hopefully be really helpful. And that database ought to help local authorities enforce some of the new regulations, because there was a story out in The Guardian just yesterday about how poor enforcement is, and 2 in 3 councils, I think, had not prosecuted any landlords in the last few years. And then there'll also be a new ombudsman. There's already an ombudsman for the social rented sector, and that is a body that you can go to in order to get redress that is short of going to court, because that can obviously be daunting. And then later, those will be coming into force in late next year, we're hearing. And then even further down the track, there'll be a decent home standard for the private rented sector. 1 in 5 rented homes currently don't meet the decent home standards. So that will be good once that comes into force, although the government consulted on timelines, and the timeline that they suggested in their consultation was 2035, which is obviously such a long time away. And then there's also Awab's law for the private rented sector. So this was a change brought in for the social rented sector, whereby social landlords have to respond to complaints about damp and mold within serious complaints about damp and mold within a certain time frame. And that is also being implemented in the private rented sector, but there's more consultations. So there'll be more delays on that, unfortunately.
So lots of it is in general sort of just making it so that private landlords have some standards instead of it being a bit of a wild west. Sometimes the standards that social housing already has to meet is now being sort of expanded to include private landlords. I know you're quite active on Twitter in your campaigning for this bill, before and after it being passed. Someone you've been sparring with is free marketeer Sam Bowman, who we've had on this show before, actually. Interesting guy. Instead of going to your tweets, I'm going to go to his tweet and then find out why you disagree, because I saw you disagreeing on Twitter. So Sam Bowman says, under this bill, new tenants will be able to challenge their rent at a tribunal within 6 months of moving in. This means tribunals will be able to control all market rents, not just rent rises within a tenancy. This is straightforward rent control across the entire market. The pretext of the bill is that tribunals will have to refer to market rates to determine if rates are too high, or rent rises are too high, but this is circular. All market rents, including new tenancies, will be set under rent tribunals' jurisdiction. There will be no market rate to refer to. I'd previously thought this bill was bad but survivable. Now I realise that it controls rents between tenancies as well as within them. I believe that it is bringing first-generation rent controls to the English rental market. This could be very, very bad. Now, I know you were critical of that argument. I suppose, can you explain why?
Sure. It's nice to know when you're beefing with someone on Twitter at 11 p.m. that it might get picked up eventually. Essentially, there already is you can, as a renter, already appeal to tribunal to challenge a rent increase. I would say most people don't know this, and that's because Section 21 exists. What will happen is if a renter does challenge their rent increase, they'll often just get evicted. And so advice organisations like those in our coalition don't advise people to challenge their rent increase. So there will be more renters challenging their rent increases, which is we're pleased about, I think, and think that that's a good thing, that renters will be empowered to challenge a rent increase. And actually, without it, you haven't got rid of no-fault evictions, right? Because my landlord could turn around and say, I double your rent. For me, that would be me being evicted because I couldn't pay that. And I think we pushed for, in the bill, we did actually push for a cap on in-tenancy rent increases, which, depending on your definition, is a type of rent control. But we called for a cap on rent increases in tenancy at the lowest of inflation or wage growth, because we think that you can still get unaffordable rent increases like 20, 30%, which is what this tribunal signs off. We think that would be a better option. Coming back to Sam's argument that he put forward, basically, it's just some of the conversation on sort of right-wing libertarian Twitter is just completely actually sort of both divorced from the reality of everyone in the sector, including like big landlord, be that sort of like organized sort of like small landlords, but also like big institutional landlords as well. So, I've been at a round table with ministers and these organizations, and there's no one there making the Sam Bowman point. Now, I'm sure he would say that that's that is sort of like the blob, and the problem with this law is that there's so much consensus around it. But actually, I think he's precisely wrong about the consensus. So we have been living with completely deregulated private renting since as I mentioned before, since the sort of Thatcher deregulation of renting. And it's led to absolutely terrible outcomes for renters, particularly, like, obviously there are housing crises around the world, but I think particularly in England, we have some of the worst rented housing. The Resolution Foundation said ours, in terms of per square foot, in terms of what you get in terms of value for money, the quality of the housing, ours is the worst value for money of any country, high-income country in the world. And so we've been living with what happens when you try to deregulate renting. I would say also at the same time maybe constraining supply of homes, both in terms of total number of homes, but particularly, I guess, social housing and affordable housing, at the same time as deregulating renting. And the outcomes are not pretty. You basically get an ever bigger private rented sector and ever more landlords, and the outcomes are not good for renters in a sort of both in a sort of like outcomes in terms of like affordability, quality, etc., but also distributional. Do you want to live in a society? Like sometimes I use the example of if we had 10% of society was landlords and the other 90% were renters. Obviously, that's an extreme hypothetical, but like that would, even if renting was affordable and no one had damp and mold, it still wouldn't be a good situation because it would just be really unfair. As a renter, you transfer your main expense is to transfer wealth away from yourself. So, yeah, that's a long way of saying I sort of profoundly sort of disagree with Sam, I think. And I think there's a particular thing around some of these people who are right-wing or libertarian ideologues, I would say. And when that sort of worldview comes up against renting and the policy experiment that we've been living for the last 30 or 40 years, they struggle to sort of, I guess, get their head around it and process it in a way that makes sense with their worldview, is what I would argue.
That was Tom Darling from the Renters Reform Coalition. The Guardian piece he referred to in the conversation was this one. So it was an investigation by Matthew Pearce showing that only 1/3 of councils had prosecuted a landlord in the past 3 years, despite receiving over 300,000 complaints from tenants in unfit homes. Real issue, actually, in terms of giving tenants these extra rights, that you also need quite a lot of money for enforcement. Otherwise, it's not going to make that much difference. Freddie, I suppose from a Labour perspective, the Renters' Rights Act seems like a genuinely decent change. Of course, it was originally Tory legislation, but they couldn't get it through because their backbenchers were too anti-renter, I suppose. This would potentially be the kind of policy that could appeal to people flooding to the Greens. Yet Labour aren't talking about it. Is it incompetence or is it something else?
I think it's probably a little bit of incompetence. I mean, have we spoken about many of the things that we've done right? Have we spoken enough about free school meals? Have we spoken enough about workers' rights? I mean, the answer is obviously no. To the people in the chat, cooking me as a Labour person, that's the reason why I'm still here, guys. Like ultimately, as you said, the Tories could have passed this as legislation. Why could they not do it? Well, so many of them are landlords. And look, I think maybe part of it is that there are members of working people who have a second property that they get passive income off, and maybe they don't want to piss those people off. Maybe that's the thinking. I don't know. Is it? I mean, I would like them to speak more about it, because as a young person, I know how fucked it is right now to be trying to rent in this market. Like, you'll see black mold in your gaff and you'll text your landlord and then they won't turn up, or some cowboy builder will, and you won't do nothing about it. So I completely accept that. There's a gap in information about the things that the government are doing right that needs to be fixed.
British political commentator Sami Hamdi returned to the UK last week after spending 2 weeks in ICE detention. Hamdi was arrested on the 26th of October at San Francisco Airport while midway through a US speaking tour where he was speaking against Israel's genocide of the people of Gaza. The arrest followed a campaign against Hamdi by far-right activist and Donald Trump ally Laura Loomer. And this is how the State Department publicly justified his detention. So they said this: "We've said it before, we'll say it again. The United States has no obligation to host foreigners who support terrorism and actively undermine the safety of Americans. We continue to revoke the visas of persons engaged in such activity." That was their public explanation. However, Hamdi's charging document did not identify any criminal conduct or security grounds as the reason for his detention. Instead, he was accused of overstaying his visa, which had been revoked the day before without him being notified. I spoke to Sami Hamdi earlier today and asked him to describe his experience in ICE detention.
So on the Monday before I was arrested on the Sunday. On the Monday before, Laura Loomer, a far-right activist, if you want to call her that, tweeted and said that there is an individual from the UK who's going around the United States lecturing, we need to revoke his visa. I had been lecturing in the US on a number of occasions in Stanford, Berkeley, CUNY, and these other prestigious institutions. And I was there on an invitation on this occasion by the Council of American Islamic Relations, talking about a situation in Gaza, in Syria, and in the Middle East more broadly. On the Monday, she posted a video of me where I was talking about the impact of social media on changing public opinion. She said we need to get his visa revoked. This was a week after Ted Cruz and Dinesh D'Souza had suggested something similar. On the Wednesday, she tweeted and said that, guys, I'm in Congress. And she made a few Islamophobic comments, but then said, I have very good news coming to you in 2 days. And I knew that she was talking about me. She said, the news in 2 days about a certain individual touring the United States. On the Friday, I gave my lecture in the Bay Area, Saturday in Sacramento, Sunday morning at about 7 o'clock, I arrive at San Francisco Airport to fly to Florida. I check in my bag, I go through security, I look up to see where gate D38 is to fly to Tampa. And the man approaches me and says, "Excuse me, are you Sami Hamdi?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Your visa was revoked, has been revoked, and now you're here illegally." I said, "Nobody told me that my visa was even under review. What do you mean it's been revoked?" He said, "Here is the memo from the State Department." So I opened it, I had to look at it. It didn't state any reason whatsoever for the revocation of the visa. Nothing about anything I'd said or done or any crime or any, it just said the State Department has the right to revoke whenever it wants, and it's decided to revoke it. So I said to him that, "What's the reason for it?" He said, "We haven't been told, we were just told to pick you up." I said, "Well, look, I'm a British citizen. I was supposed to go home in 4 days anyway. I'll just book my ticket now from San Francisco. There's 6 flights a day and fly home now." He told me that's not how this works. And then 5 other agents appeared from behind me and surrounded me. When I walked with them outside the airport, there was a black car with tinted windows. So I didn't enter the car. They told me enter the car. I said, "I'm not entering." They said, "We told you to enter the car." I said, "Listen, I'm a British citizen. I don't need to believe you are who you say you are. This feels too much like the movies. If I'm going to enter the car, you should at least let me call a civil liberties organization so I can understand my rights and what I can and cannot do. So I need to call somebody on my phone." They said, "No, you can't call anybody." Then when I insisted, I said, "There's no way I'm entering the car. We can just stand here all day." One of them said, "You got 1 minute," in a very gruff and aggressive way. So I called a lawyer from the Council of American Islamic Relations who told me, "Comply, but just find your alien number and let us know where you are." When I told them, "Now let me call my family just to let them know I'm okay," a agent from behind me grabs me, pushes me against the door, handcuffs my hands at the back really tightly, and they throw me in the car. And I go on a 6-hour journey in which I was then loaded into 2 different, a van and a car, so a car to the processing center. They tried to make me sign to say I am guilty and I'm being deported. I said, "For what crime?" And I looked at the charge sheet, and the charge sheet said, "You're guilty of overstaying." I said, "Well, I'm not guilty of overstaying. My visa's till 2028. It's a 10-year visa. I'm not guilty of anything. I'm not signing." They said, "If you want to go home, we'll make it easy. Just sign." I said, "I'm not signing." Then they bundled me into a van in which the space in the back was maybe 80 centimeters by 4 meters. Very cramped, claustrophobic space. They drove us for 2 hours and a half. We stopped in a car park. This is all while I'm in cuffs, hands, feet, and chain around my body, in shackles, basically. We arrive in a car park 2.5 hours later. Then they bundle me into another black car, which is an even tighter space than the van. And then we drive another 2 hours and a half until we get to a facility called McFarland. When we entered the facility, at this point, they still haven't let me call my lawyer. They haven't let me, know my rights. They haven't said anything to me except that in the facility, they'll explain to you what can be done. We entered the facility, and in front of me were 2 Indians and a Latino guy. And I want to emphasize this particular story because it gives you an insight into the kind of the mentality of the guards that were watching over us. So the Latino guy walks in and the lady says, "Where are you from?" And as a joke, he says, "Afghanistan." And she says, "Oh, Afghanistan, your people want to kill my people." And he looks baffled and bewildered. He said, "What do you mean? No, we don't want to kill anyone." And I'm looking baffled at her. And she says, "Yes, your people want to kill Americans." I said, "Excuse me, that's categorically not true." And then the Latino guy says, No, I'm not Afghan, I'm just Mexican." Then they make you give over your stuff, change your clothes, you put in your blue clothes. They take you in a hall where there are more than 100 people in this hall. It's all with bunk beds. And you can tell that it's overcrowded. There's not enough pillows, not enough blankets and the like and whatnot. And at this point, still, I haven't been offered my phone call with the lawyer. They said, "There's this card, you have 5 minutes free, you can use a payphone." And I was able to call the lawyer just to let them know at least that I was in McFarland. On the second day, I fell very ill. On my left side, it was something that I ate. The food there has like sweet corn with black spots on it, beans that look like they were pulled out 2 days after their expiry date, meat that smells funny. And the inmates tell me that it used to taste worse, but it used to be worse before. So while I'm there, I fell ill on the following day on my left side in agony. I was convinced I had blown a kidney or a spleen or something. When I went to the guard to say, "Listen, I'm in agony here. I'm struggling to breathe. I have a problem all on my left side." And she said to me, "Okay, I'll let the medical team know." 1 hour passes, 2 hour passes, 3 hour passes. And the other inmates are saying, listen, we think we know what's wrong with you. You're not going to see a doctor. They don't come to see us. Take an ibuprofen to make you survive the pain, and the doctor will come when they come. I went to the guard. I need to see a doctor. Doctor comes when they come. And then when the guard really felt sympathy for me after 3 hours and she could see I'm struggling, she said to me, she whispered in my ear and she said to me, listen, the doctor's already here and already has been here, but they won't come unless you drop on the floor right now. So instead of dropping on the floor, I called my wife and I said, please tell the media this is what's happening. And when the media pressure came, the doctors ended up coming, quite upset, but they treated me a bit better afterwards, although I was sick for the 7-8 days, continuously vomiting. On the third day, I won't go day by day. Just in case anybody's worried, I'm going to go through all 18 days. On the third day, I was told that I was going to Fresno. And this was told to me about 8:30 p.m. And the inmates all said, listen, they might be transferring you. So what ICE do, ICE are aware that the overwhelming number of cases in these facilities, if they're brought before a court, then it is most likely that the inmate is going to win. So ICE try to frustrate you from seeing a judge as much as possible. And one of the tactics is, if let's say you're supposed to see the judge tomorrow and your case is strong, ICE will randomly transfer you to a different state and a different facility to prevent you from appearing before the judge and forcing a delay in the court. For example, we had a guy who was 2 days before his final hearing. It's a master hearing, evidence hearing, then final hearing. And the poor guy had been there 9 months. 2 days before his final hearing, when ICE thought that he would be released and the judge would announce his release, they transferred him in the middle of the night from Texas all the way to California. Meaning he had to start his hearings all over again from the master hearing. When I called my lawyers and told them they're taking me to Fresno, they were worried I'd be transferred. So they went to the judge and they said to the judge, we're worried he's going to be transferred. The judge responded and said, due to concerns over freedom of speech, excuse me, due to concerns over freedom of speech, we're issuing a restraining order. He may not be transferred anywhere. 10 days later, so in the Fresno cell, actually, just a point about the Fresno cell before I finish up with the federal court. In the Fresno cell, they throw you in a 5x4 cell and put 15 inmates there. They make you sleep on the floor with cuffs on your feet. And they kept us there for 24 hours just to try to make us sign a deportation order, which was illegal. What ICE try to do is they try to mentally break you until you sign it and somehow confess to some crime. 10 days later, I received a call from my lawyers. They told me I missed a roller coaster the day before. I said, what happened? They said that the federal judge agreed to expedite my case because of serious concerns over transgressions of freedom of speech. So the lawyer of the DHS had responded and said, quote, a foreign alien does not have the right to freedom of speech, and so the court has no jurisdiction to assess it. The judge responded within the hour and said, he does have the right to freedom of speech, and we believe that there is a credible evidence that it might have been transgressed here. The following day, despite what the DHS was saying publicly, all these heinous accusations being made, privately, the lawyer of the DHS, a specific lawyer assigned to my case specifically, approached my lawyers by text, email, and phone call and said, listen, we've read an article in USA Today by his wife that he wants to go home. We're willing to let him go home. We just want to clear all this up. We just want to make it go away. We've already spoken to all the relevant authorities. We pulled the strings. If he wants to go home, we'll cancel the deportation order. We'll cancel the removal order. We'll cancel the charges and he can go home scot-free, no problem whatsoever. So I responded, I said, I've been told that whenever an inmate signs voluntary departure, you keep him here for 3 months. They said, we promise you'll be home within 3 days. On the Monday, I saw the judge, 48 hours, I was home. But this story was not about me. I was not the one being targeted. It's important to put this into a wider context in which, first, the Israeli lobby came for the citizens, threatening Mehdi Hassan, a naturalized citizen, that they might remove his citizenship. And they also went after US citizens of the American Muslims for Palestine by trying to drag them through the courts in Michigan and Nevada. And the Israeli lobby lost in those courts. The cases against American Muslims for Palestine were thrown out. So the Israeli lobby decided to go after green cards, Mahmoud Khalil and these others. But they found that even though they transferred Mahmoud Khalil to Louisiana to try to get a preferable judgment, a judge in New Jersey ruled that it was a transgression against Mahmoud Khalil and he was released. So then the Israeli lobby went after student visas, Muhsin Mahdawi and Rumaysa Ozturk and other students. Although these two were detained, they were eventually released by federal judges who protected their right to freedom of speech. And therefore, I believe that what happened to me was a hysterical lashing out on the part of the Israeli lobby to desperately find any scalp possible so that they could strike a climate of fear or create a climate of fear to stop the Palestinian advocacy, because according to the polls, it's working and Americans are turning on the Israeli lobby. Candidates are openly saying that they're not going to take AIPAC money anymore. We've seen the Marjorie Taylor Greens turn on Israel, the Tucker Carlsons, Candace Owens and the like. This was not about targeting Sami Hamdi. It was about targeting journalism, freedom of speech and advocacy, and basically saying to the Americans that if freedom of speech allows us to speak the truth about what's happening in Palestine, and the Americans are going to accept that truth, then we would rather erode freedom of speech of the Americans in order to keep up the lie that the genocide in Palestine is justified. The final point I'll say is this. The inmates were very keen to impress upon me that the reason I was able to be released in 2 weeks is because of the media coverage from Novara Media, Guardian, Middle East Eye, Reuters, BBC, and all these others. They said I was lucky to be released in 2 weeks because I had people who remembered me and were talking about me and therefore applying pressure. Even ICE, when I was going to the airport to fly back home, ICE spent 2 hours telling me sob stories about how hard their life is ruining the lives of other people, almost in an attempt, and they said it at the end, please don't write too harshly about us, we're also human too. But the reason why I mention this point is that ICE, even in my case, my original court case was November 6th, and they changed it to November 10th. When I told them, why are you changing my date to November 10th? They said that on your charge sheet, it says that you landed in Santa Ana, California. I said, yes. They said, we changed this to you were pre-cleared and took off from Calgary, Canada. I said, what difference does that make? They're both true. They said, yes, because of this edit, then we have to delay your court by 4 days. They told me I was lucky it was 4 days because of the media pressure. For somebody else, like a Latino individual called Antonio, I remember Antonio, he'd been there for 10 months, married to a US citizen. His kids are US citizens. He went to a meeting, to an appointment with ICE to update his details. They grabbed him at the appointment. His final hearing was in the week that I arrived at the facility. So he's preparing, and the overwhelming sentiment is he's going to be freed. He went to the court and came back 10 minutes after. So we said to him, Antonio, what happened? He said, ICE said they didn't have enough time to review all of the evidence, and the judge said the same thing. So the judge said, let's reschedule to January 29th. So 3 months from now. And that's just deemed acceptable. The point here being is that they catch you on the loopholes, even when the judge rules you should be free. Like Liqa Kurdiya in the Texas facility, for example, or Alma Beg, who's in the California facility in Golden State Annex. The judge in Liqa's case has ruled twice that she is to be freed immediately and to be allowed to be released into the United States. And Alma Beg, the same thing. What ICE do is, before you can see the judge to insist that you be released, they still keep you detained to try to find a third country that will take you. And they try to delay your complaint to the judge to insist on an immediate order, an enforcement order, in the hope that you will get so mentally tired, you'll go home on your own and they can say to the judge, yeah, we know you said they should be released, but they decided to go home anyway. It's these darker, bureaucratic loophole tactics that ICE uses to keep those inmates in there. And my experience there was, I was lucky I was a British citizen. I was lucky the media spoke to me. But within those walls, rule of law does not seem to apply. ICE seems to act with impunity. And it's nasty the way they keep innocent people incarcerated for so long.
And do you think this has backfired in terms of, now obviously sort of what ICE are doing and what Trump is doing, he is trying to intimidate people, and he's doing that very effectively. I think, as you say, sort of because you had so much media support, you were only in there for 2 weeks when you could have been in there much longer. I have to say, it sounds like a pretty unpleasant 2 weeks to have gone through. I don't want to underplay that. I suppose because America is quite polarized at the moment, there are a lot of people who don't like Trump, they don't like what ICE are doing. And I was almost surprised at some of the coverage you got in America. As someone who is stridently pro-Palestine, there was, after you were released, there was an interview with Wolf Blitzer on CNN. Now, Wolf Blitzer is someone who used to work for AIPAC. And that to me seemed like a very open-minded, quite friendly interview. Do you think that potentially sort of the Trump administration and the Israel lobbyists who are sort of trying to push the Trump administration to detain people like yourself. Do you think they might have overplayed their hand and it's backfired somewhat?
The sentiment I actually got from the lawyers is that it had very little to do with the Trump administration. What I got for the sentiment from the government lawyer, from the DHS lawyer, was that when all of this blew up and all the media was doing the coverage, somebody at the State Department and at the DHS sort of walks in the office and says, "What idiot listened to Laura Loomer? Who on earth brought this up? Who revoked the guy's visa? Like, who on earth put us in this mess in the first place?" The sentiment I got is that the Israeli lobby still believed it had the influence it once had, while more calmer heads in the federal courts and the State Department sort of said, "We don't need this headache at the moment." And it's very striking because it falls into this narrative of America first versus Israel first. Even Wolf Blitzer, who interviewed me, Wolf Blitzer was very clear to assert that, "Mr. Hamdi, we believe in freedom of speech here, and we reject anybody who tries to infringe on that freedom of speech." On the plane, there were Republicans sitting with me on the plane who were a bit nervous when the guards took me onto the plane and said, "Why have guards brought you on the plane? Are you some sort of serial killer?" So I showed them the articles. I had Wi-Fi on the plane about Reuters, British journalists detained for criticizing Israel. And they were horrified at the notion that their sacred freedom of speech is being undermined because I'm criticizing a foreign government. And Americans, contrary to what people tend to say about them sometimes, I found them to be very amenable people are very amenable to the truth. I went to Texas, I went to every state except New Hampshire, and you talked about what's happening in Palestine, you talked about the genocide. Even those who support the Israelis, once you sit with them and talk to them and show the images, the most common reaction was, "Well, I had no idea that's what they're doing." When you show them how much the US government is spending on the Israelis while Americans are going bankrupt because they're unable to pay medical bills, you can see the frustration on the face of the Americans and the way that they're turning away from what they once perceived to be this ally that they had to defend at all costs. And that's why I think that, your point is well noted. It's not just this reason why I think that it wasn't about me specifically. I think Americans were so offended on the attack on freedom of speech, which is why you had across the spectrum, from the Wolf Blitzers to the Medea Benjamins and these others all coming out, and Norman Finkelsteins all coming out and saying that this is dangerous, in that this is an attack not on Sami Hamdi, a British journalist. This is an attack on American freedoms, and we need to do something about it. And I think that's an extraordinary development. And I think when all is said and done, the reality is that the manner in which the American State Department allowed me to leave the United States, I think speaks volumes about the extent to which the Israeli lobby is losing its influence. And in the words of Donald Trump, who told I think the Financial Times, they reported it about 3-4 months ago, he told Zionist donors that, "Listen, I'm just warning you, my base is starting to hate you." I think the Americans are deeply starting to hate AIPAC and the Israeli lobby that is now threatening their fundamental freedoms.
You return to America while Trump is still president. I know you were sort of midway through a speaking tour. Will you finish that speaking tour?
The sentiment I got from the lawyer was that just go back, wait for it to die down, apply for a visa and come back. Like, we won't make it difficult for you. And also, I think that if the aim of Laura Loomer and the Israeli lobby is to prevent us from speaking to the American people because there is a fear that the Americans are actually listening, it would mean that she won if I stay away from the States. And I think that the hospitality and the kindness and the generosity I saw from the Americans, I think that the idea that Laura Loomer is the arbiter of freedom of speech is so repulsive to the ordinary American that I think that Laura Loomer is in the overwhelmingly extreme minority, is in the extreme minority in the United States. I think America is a pleasant land. Americans are wonderful people. And I'm sure I'll be welcomed very warmly when I decide to go, maybe even before the end of next year.
And finally, while we've got you, I just want to get your opinion on sort of the latest news coming from Gaza. So the UN Security Council have today approved Trump's plan for Gaza. What's your response to that?
I think right now there's two loud voices that are shouting in Trump's ear, trying to convince him on the future of Gaza. On the one side, you have the Israelis who are reeling from the way in which Trump imposed a ceasefire that they did not want, and the way that Trump is lending his other ear to the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who is telling Trump that he should allow Turkish troops into Gaza. Trump believes that this international stabilizing force, given that Turkey has, in Trump's view at least, been able to keep the peace in Syria, the Israelis are terrified that if Turkish troops are sent into Gaza, it will take the prospect of annexing Gaza off the table. while this doesn't necessarily meet the demands of the Palestinians, I think what is clear is that even if the Palestinians are not having their way, for the first time, neither are the Israelis. And I think that has a lot to do with the transactional nature of Donald Trump. And I think I'll put it, if I had to summarize it, I'd put it in this way. Under Harris or Biden or Obama or Bush or any of these other people who came before, there was a framework that AIPAC imposed that no president found the ability to be able to shake off. Bob Bush in 2008 when he threatened the Israelis. The thing with Donald Trump is he's so unpredictable and so driven by his own desires and poll ratings that even if the Palestinians are unable to ascertain what he's going to do, for the first time, the Zionists don't know what he's going to do either, which is why Netanyahu has gone to Washington 5 times in this particular year. I don't know if this international force will make things better. What I think the optimism is in this latest move is it's clearly something the Israelis do not want. And if that's the case, then clearly they're no longer in control in the way there was before. And that opens opportunities indeed for the Palestinians to advance their cause and perhaps exert some influence over a plan that Trump claims is already done. But in reality, he doesn't really care much about the fine print as long as the media headlines say that he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize.
That was Sami Hamdi speaking to me earlier today. My thanks to Freddie Feltham for joining me throughout the show. Thank you all for watching. And we'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.